When I was 26, I became an executive at an 8-figure company leading a team of over 40 people. But what nobody told me was just how fundamentally different the rules of the game of leadership were. That is, how I was providing value to the business beforehand was now no longer sufficient. Because what got me to the role and the skills that got me to the role, which for me were being halfway decent at public speaking and being all right with spreadsheets, were no longer enough to cover for my lack of tangible leadership skills. And so for me, whilst my career progression was doing this, very quickly, not only did that progress start to stagnate, but it also started to go back in the other direction. Because for me, my physical health started to suffer. I put on tons of weight. My mental health started to suffer because I was bringing home a lot of the burdens and a lot of the fires that I was putting out, which meant that my sleep started to suffer too. And as a result of all that, unfortunately, my personal relationships suffered too. And so for me, what I was able to do to turn it all around and start to thrive in this leadership role was to apply these 4 fluff-free steps that we'll go through. And for me, it's all about walking the talk. How can you make your leadership completely visible? And it doesn't require you to go and study a 2-year MBA in leadership or to go and do all these courses. You can actually turn it completely around in 10 weeks, and I'm going to show you the exact same 4 steps that I used. So let's dive on in. Step 1 is all about understanding this concept of the theory of constraints, and it only takes you your first out of the 10 weeks. If you can imagine visually this pipeline, because as we move from left to right, your leadership style and systems impact all of these yellow dots. And these yellow dots mean and signify the flow of your team's productivity, culture, and outcomes. Now, depending on what your leadership style and your systems and your habits and your behaviors are, there are going to be some things that produce a minor bottleneck on your team's results, and there are going to be some things that really constrict that flow and provide major bottlenecks to your team's results. And I've got a few examples here. So with all of these yellow dots, you can see the green parts being a minor bottleneck because it still provides enough space for your team to flow through with results. That could be something like team meetings feeling inefficient. It's a problem, but it's not a major problem blocking the amazing results that your team can produce. Whereas the major bottlenecks are the ones that constrict your results the most, and that could be something as simple as avoiding or having unsuccessful hard conversations that really provide that constructive feedback for a team member to completely turn around how they're performing in their role. Now, the first thing that you need to understand as a leader is the things that you are avoiding, that is the major bottlenecks. By avoiding those, you're going to be in a world of suffering. You're going to start to suffer and lead to those same mistakes that I was making, but not only that, you're going to pass on that suffering indirectly to your team. And by focusing on these minor bottlenecks, by saying, oh, our team meetings are inefficient, let's cut back our meetings from 60 minutes to 30 minutes, and let's make some new agendas to truly try and hone down that process. All of those things sound great in theory, but what we will do is it will indirectly cause eye rolls in your team because you're not solving the big problems that they can see on their end. And so step 1 is about recognizing the only way to really thrive and turn around your leadership is to go for the things that are blocking the most amount of progress. And the one that I'd like for you to really focus on is this concept of either a fear of failure or a fear of rejection. Let's go through what each of these 2 things mean very quickly. So a fear of failure is thinking, if I don't control or mitigate all of the risk that might happen in people doing their roles, I might look incompetent or I might look as a failure as a leader. And that begins to manifest in things such as procrastination or perfectionism or micromanagement or imposter syndrome. On the other hand, having a fear of rejection is thinking, if I say the things that need to be said, I might make people dislike me, or I might not become respected, or it might make my relationships become awkward. And that manifests in things like people pleasing or conflict avoidance or things of that nature, or like withdrawn behaviors. And so what I want you to do is to determine, do you have a subconscious fear of failure or a subconscious fear of rejection? Because I can guarantee that the influence that that fear would have is probably going to be giving you the most major bottleneck to the results that you'd like to see in your team. Now, to put it more simply for you, I know for me, I had a massive fear of rejection. Because for me, I was internally promoted into that executive role, and I was in a position where I had a lot of my colleagues who were a lot older than me. And so for me, I was in the position of how can I provide value to these people and provide value to my team without coming across as someone who's younger and potentially cocky or potentially egotistical. And so for me, the idea of being rejected was a real fundamental fear that manifested in avoiding having hard conversations, because I didn't feel like I was an expert enough to be able to tell someone who was a lot older than me some constructive feedback on how they can improve their results in their role. And so if you're thinking you might have a fear of failure or a fear of rejection, what I want you to do is consider this concept called self-awareness. Now, self-awareness has two types. There is internal self-awareness and external self-awareness. Internal self-awareness is how clearly you see your own thoughts, emotions, and values. Whereas external self-awareness is how clearly your team sees you as you do yourself. And where you have some gaps in either internal self-awareness or external self-awareness is where these fears of failure and fears of rejection come. So let's zoom in on this diagram here. So if you're someone like me who had a fear of rejection going into that role, it meant that I was really high on the external self-awareness, but I had a gap in the internal self-awareness, and I kind of landed in this quadrant here. In the people-pleasing quadrant, I was prioritizing other people's perceptions over the values that I stood for myself, which again manifested in me avoiding having conversations. For anyone who has more of a fear of failure that influences their leadership, you would be more in the introspectors quadrant, whereas you're very clear on your values, but sometimes you would have some blind spots as to what other people are seeing, which then lowers the amount of trust that you could develop in your team. So for example, if you're heading a project and you need to make sure this project is done and you're consistently checking your team with how the progress is performing, that is known as something called micromanagement, which means that you would have really high internal self-awareness. You know you stand for excellence and you stand for results. But externally, your team is seeing someone who is potentially impeding on their autonomy or lowering their sense of control and power over the tasks that they've been assigned. Now, I need to reassure with you that it's not that you're wrong or that you're a bad person if you're someone who has a fear of failure or a fear of rejection. This is all about understanding where these fears originate so that we can come up with a plan to overcome them. Because when you do improve both internal and external self-awareness, what you do is you end up in the self-aware quadrant. You know who you are, you know what you stand for, you value giving feedback to others, and you seek feedback yourself. This is the ideal that we want to be progressing and aiming towards, where these fears don't control us and they don't manifest in all the other suffering that we do experience from time to time. And so, if you have, let's go back to my example, if you have a fear of rejection that might be subconsciously influencing your decisions, what you want to do is you want to find ways to increase your self-awareness. And you can do that in two ways. One of the things that you can do is really set clear boundaries. A boundary is just telling another person how you're going to act if a certain line is crossed. And so if you're ever in a one-to-one conversation and starting to get emotionally heated, you can say, I can't continue this conversation, let's recoup in the next hour or so. So that's one way you can do it. Another thing that you can do is whenever you're having a hard conversation or you're trying to hesitate or find excuses as to how you can avoid having them, what we would really challenge you to do is to prioritize your long-term goals with that colleague from a relationship perspective over your short-term discomfort. You know, we always want to aim for long-term goals over the long-term potential resentment that can come out of it. Or alternatively, if you're experiencing a fear of failure, the way that you can overcome that is by increasing your external self-awareness. And again, here are two ideas on how you can do that. The first of them is to begin to express some small vulnerabilities in front of your team. Now, vulnerabilities does not mean oversharing or exposing your deepest and darkest secrets. It could be something as simple as in a team meeting, if you're unsure about an idea that was raised, asking a question in front of everybody, I'm sorry, I don't quite get what you're saying. Can you explain that in a different way? What that does is it makes you feel and appear to be more human, which is what your team would like to see more of. And so what that means is trust goes up in your team. Alternatively, another way that you can overcome a fear of failure by increasing your external self-awareness is by asking your team for more feedback. It's a scary thing to do, but when you ask your team either in a private one-to-one if you feel more comfortable or a team setting, where do you think my blind spots are? That is an amazingly powerful question. It does require a lot of courage to ask that. And look, the responses that you get are either going to be one of two things. It could be something that's really valid, or you can thank the employee or your team member for that feedback, but explain to them why you can't take that on board because they're missing a key piece of context that your role privileges you with that information that they can't quite see. At the end of the day, it's a win-win because you're again building the trust. Now, ultimately, a fear of failure and a fear of rejection is something that's really hard for anyone to just say, yep, I can understand that that's influencing my decisions. And so what you need to do is you have to sometimes go externally to work out what's going on subconsciously in your mind. And so I've got two recommendations here. How do you work out whether you've got a fear of rejection or a fear of failure? I would recommend Googling Principles U. It is one of those classic personality diagnostic tools. It's made by Ray Dalio, the famous investor. It takes about 30 minutes. It's a really comprehensive quiz. And it's also completely for free, and you get a really great report out of it at the end. I also want to say I'm not sponsored by Ray Dalio and his team at all. I've just used it, and I think it's an amazing resource. Or alternatively, I would recommend asking your best friend or your closest family member. Just ask them, do you think I have a fear of rejection or a fear of failure that might be influencing how I show up to you in our relationship? And obviously you explain to them what I said before, what a failure or rejection fear looks like, but sometimes getting that external opinion can really, really help. All right, let's jump across to step 2. This one, again, only takes about a week to turn things around, and it's all about clarifying your standards. What I want you to do is I need you to understand as a leader, when you observe an employee doing something, when you observe a team member performing an action, in your mind, subconsciously, you're going to classify that as either above expectation, at expectation, or below expectation. You might not consciously realize you're doing this, but I need you to bring those thoughts to the forefront. Because in order to really turn your leadership around, you need to be able to either reinforce the things that you want to see, so desirable actions, or you want to be able to redirect the things that you don't want to see, that is undesirable actions. Here is put simply, whenever you spot something that's above expectation or at expectation, the technique that you're going to do is you're going to reinforce it. We want to quickly reinforce it so it keeps happening and that develops the culture within your team. Whenever you spot something that's below expectation that is valid and doesn't encroach onto micromanagement, we're going to redirect those. Now let's talk a little bit more specifically about these before I show you how you would actually go about reinforcing and redirecting. And so when you're observing something, it's really important to understand that in order to help you classify whether it's at, above, or below expectation, is you need to know what success looks like so that you can articulate that gap potentially for your team member. And so if you can measure or observe all actions as one of two things, either a task, so something your employee does to achieve some sort of outcome, or a behavior, which is something your employee does that influences an outcome in associating with another person, we can begin to use things within our business to be able to measure whether the observed task or behavior was desirable or undesirable. So whenever you observe a task, you've got 4 options as to where you can look to measure success. You can compare the task with the role's KPIs, so key performance indicators, with the job descriptions, with any industry or business policies or standard operating procedures, or the vision of the company. Now, ultimately, with these 4 options, the 3 in green are really cut and dry. For everybody, it's really easy to know, just off the top of our heads, when we observe something, whether it aligns with the KPIs, the JDs, and the SOPs. I've highlighted vision as red because that's a bit more vague. It's a bit more intangible. If you're working at an accounting firm, let's say, for example, and you can see that a task that was done by one of your team members had a several amount of mistakes in it, and the vision of your business is to be the world's greatest leader in accounting services, being able to compare those to the vision does require you to unpack and unbundle what that vision means in day-to-day layman's terms. So I've highlighted it red because it does require you as a leader to use a bit more critical thinking, but it's such a powerful way to compare a task to something that you're working towards that really is the source of intrinsic motivation. So to recap, for measuring the success of tasks, you've got 4 options. But in order to articulate how an employee's task compares to the vision, it requires you to break down that really big, bold, ambitious vision into some day-to-day actions. You know, in order for us to become the world's greatest leader in accounting services, we need to mitigate mistakes, something to that effect. Whenever you're observing an employee behavior and trying to discern whether it's at, above, or below expectation, the best thing that you can do is to compare it to the values of the business. And let's say, for example, one of your values is people first. What I also encourage you to do, it's a similar reason why it's highlighted red, is to unbundle it. You need to make it less vague and more tangible for your team. And so if you're observing one of your team members on the phone to a client and they're starting to get quite frustrated and you're sensing some emotional responses and you want to share with them some private one-to-one constructive feedback, the way that you would do that is you would say, we are a company that values people first. People first could mean to be more patient. So in those situations where you're feeling like you're butting heads with a client and the conversation isn't progressing, what I'd like for you to do is ask them questions that signal more curiosity, like, what am I missing here? Or asking them questions to get more information out of them and to show empathetic, active listening. When you break down your values, which can be interpreted in many different ways by each employee, into tangible behaviors, that really does help the success in having those hard conversations. All right. So now let's jump across to, now that we understand what we're trying to aspire towards, how can we have those chats? And that's all about step 3. This is probably the most uncomfortable step out of all 3, and it does take 4 weeks. So weeks 3 to 6, you can easily do it. And it's all about mastering the core 5 private talks. But we're going to start off with this pie chart here. And the first thing is, this isn't rooted in research. This is more anecdotally based on my experience. But for the 99.9% of leadership roles, where all your results and the value that you provide are being driven is provided more from your one-to-one conversations than your team-wide meetings. I'm not saying that your public team meetings don't have value, but you're going to be able to drive far greater amount of value and results by really honing in your ability to have one-on-one conversations. Which, coming from a position where you want to try and grow and improve your leadership, it's a more safer environment. A one-to-one situation is much more psychologically safe than trying to improve how you speak in front of an entire team, just like you and I are doing right now as you're watching this video. And so for this video, we're trying to completely transform your leadership in 10 weeks. So we only want to focus on the areas that has the most amount of leverage. So we're going to focus on the private talks. In saying that, the really cool thing is, again, in my experience, 90% of all of the private one-to-one talks that I could ever have with a team member comes from one of 5 different types. And the 10% could be your special cases, like potentially being in a meeting where you're giving someone a formal warning, or there's performance management, or you're providing someone with a promotion or a raise, or you're terminating someone. Those are very rare cases and very rare conversations. And again, we're focusing on high leverage transformation here. So we're going to spend the majority of our time perfecting the only 5 conversations that you could have one-to-one with one of your team members. And here they are. So the first one is, and we'll go from top to bottom here. Let's go back to when we were saying when you want to reinforce an above expectation action, which could be a task or a behavior. The first conversation that you want to master is how you reinforce those above expectation actions, and you do those with non-tangible rewards. Non-tangible rewards can be a public, as in you just walk up next to an employee and you're giving them either praise or recognition in the moment, but you're still delivering it one-to-one, even though other people can overhear it. Or you're having a private one-to-one meeting where you're providing them with praise or recognition. Those non-tangible rewards work far greater to provide intrinsic motivation for your employee than giving your employees a pizza. I'm not saying giving a pizza doesn't have value, but those non-tangible rewards have far greater impact from research to be able to boost employee performance. That's the easiest one to do out of all 5, and I highly recommend that you start here. Because another piece of research that was done by Heafy and Lasada back in 2004 said that if you want to reinforce above expectation actions and redirect below expectation actions, the optimal ratio to really build a productive relationship between you and your team member is 5-1. What that means is, for every time you want to give constructive feedback to an employee, that is to redirect their actions, you want to give 5 times as much praise and recognition, because you want people to not feel stuck. You want to feel like you have a belief in them that they can improve. And I really encourage, therefore, you start here, not only because it's the easiest for you, but because naturally you're going to start doing it more, which means that you're building that optimal feedback ratio. The second one is reinforcing at expectation actions, and that's with acknowledgement. Again, this is a strategy that you can still use for that 5-1 ratio, but it's this idea of the thank you and the power of the thank you. Let's say, for example, someone on your team is a receptionist at your business, and one of their responsibilities is to welcome clients as they walk into your building. If you never say to them, thank you for welcoming our clients in and for providing them a great experience, what happens is, over time, as human beings, we naturally start to take shortcuts and we naturally start to become unmotivated. It's not because that employee is doing the wrong thing. It's because you as the leader aren't validating that the work that they're doing has value. It'd be the same as saying, as you were washing the dishes for your family for the past 10 years and nobody in your family ever said to you, thank you. Naturally, you're starting to become unmotivated to do it, or you might start to take shortcuts and potentially there might be some food stains left over on some plates. It's not because you're a bad person or a bad provider to your family. It's because you haven't been validated that the work that you're doing has meaning and has value. So acknowledgement is all about just reminding ourselves about the power of thanking our team for the work that they're doing, even though it's at expectation. Because when you thank someone doing at expectation work, it reinforces it to keep going. The third one is all about how you can build your one-to-one relationship with a team member, and they're known as your empathetic check-in. There's 2 different types. You've got your spontaneous check-in for when you notice that one of your team members is suffering, but there's an inclusion there. When your team member is suffering and you want to check in with them, are you okay? But there's a very big difference between suffering and struggling. When an employee is struggling, we need to normalize that being as okay. People struggle in their roles, so what you want to do in those instances and say, hey, this looks really challenging, let me know if I can be of any help, and then walk away. Because the second that you start to rescue your team member, you might be robbing them from a sense of autonomy, or you might be encouraging the development of something like learned helplessness. Either way, spontaneous check-ins do help to build the relationship, in the sense that I want to make sure that I'm available for to support you if needed, but likewise, if you come and knock on my door and ask me for help, I want to be available for that too. The other way that you can build empathetic check-ins is to have your regular one-to-one meetings. It doesn't matter if they're on a weekly basis, a fortnightly basis, or a monthly basis. You just want to make sure that they're regularly scheduled, they're uninterrupted, and that one-to-one time is all about you seeking feedback from the employee as to how you're leading them, but also helping support them in their goals. And being really, really good at those one-to-one conversations allows you to put out fires a lot more successfully whilst they are still small, before they eventuate and compound into big things. And so again, another pretty easy one to do. In fact, the first 3 are really easy in terms of how psychologically safe it makes you feel to be able to begin to try and actively improve in this space. So I recommend you start here. These last 2 are the tricky ones. These are going to be the ones that cause the most hesitation and the most avoidance. But again, going back to our theory of constraints, if this is where the major bottleneck is for you, you've got to face it, you've got to fight the way through it. The only way to overcome a fear, unfortunately, is to go through it. You know, one technique I used when I was trying to have a hard conversation is I'd reward myself. I'd say to myself, look, if I can give constructive feedback to that person, whether it was a successful conversation or not, But if I was able to overcome that fear that was holding me back, I'd take myself off to the movies that night. You know, rewarding yourself for those steps of courageousness and those steps of bravery is going to do wonders for your team. And so constructive feedback and accountability are two conversations that you can have when you observe an action that's below expectation. Now, my advice to you is, because you can go about this in many different ways, however, my advice to you is two things. Number one, you want to assume that the employee isn't being supported enough, or you weren't clear enough in the instructions and the directions that you gave. So you want to approach these conversations from the perspective of that employee is just trying their best, and I may have not delivered clearly enough what my expectations were. So if you approach it from that perspective, you're going to signal to the other person that you have good intent going into those chats, and therefore it will increase the chances of it being a successful conversation and decrease the chances of your team member becoming defensive in that chat. The second thing that you want to do is you want to be future focused, not past dwelling. What that means is if you've got some feedback on how you can redirect a below expectation action, tell your team member what they can do next time. Don't make them feel bad for what the mistake they made in the past was. You're not blaming them. You're saying, what can we do to make this go better next time? Having that future focused framework motivates and encourages the employee to fix it. Otherwise, they're going to feel stuck, they're going to feel blame, or even worse, even shame that their underperformance means they're not a good person, and that's not what we want to do. Now, how can you go about doing these hard conversations, particularly when it comes to constructive feedback and accountability? You need to work on not just what you say, but also how you sound and how you look. When you combine all three ways that your words, your body language, and also your tone of voice combine, you align the three types of communication that I'm having with you, which just provides more consistency in your message, and it means that the other person has a higher chance of feeling safe. So here's what I recommend that you do. Spend a couple of weeks actually scripting out how you're going to deliver future-focused constructive feedback or accountability, or script out how you can praise or recognize your team. Have a go. Use ChatGPT, use some ideas, or get some brainstorming ideas from your colleagues as well. You need to be intentional to create a script, use it, measure whether it was successful, and then iterate and improve it over time. I promise you, you're only 5 conversations away from getting pretty good at it. Better than 99% of others. The next thing is with your vocal intent. Intent has a really powerful thing. If you're going into a conversation with the intent that you want to help and support your team member, naturally you're going to be more vibrant in your voice. You're not going to be dull or accusatory. For me, as I was recording this video, it's coming from a place of, just before I hit record, I thought to myself, I can't wait to share with you watching this video the 10 weeks of 4-step transformation that I used to completely turn my life around. I'm excited. And as a result, I'm smiling naturally. I'm speaking enthusiastically, naturally. If you do that and you have good intent that you check before going into a conversation, you're just going to increase the likelihood of it being a success. And the last one is to have a bit of a checklist with your visuals. You know, here's an example. If I am giving you constructive feedback, it's not a disciplinary conversation. I'm trying to help you set yourself up for success. And so visually, something that you can do is to look at the person. Don't be distracted by your phone or by your screen. You could do subtle things like a slight tilt of your head to signal curiosity when you ask them, what's your perspective, or what was your experience like with all of this? Or even when it comes to giving feedback, don't sit across from the person. Sit either at a 90-degree angle or side by side, because you want to signal with your body language that this isn't a disciplinary conversation. I'm not blaming you. You're not in trouble. We're trying to work together on making your results better and better for the team. The last thing that I want you to do and focus the last 4 weeks on is this concept of being influential. As a leader, you've got one of two ways to lead and to have your team produce the results that you consider to be desirable. Either you can influence your team or you can manipulate your team. They're quite polarizing, but it's the truth. When you're having a fear of failure or a fear of rejection influence how you show up as a leader, you're going to start to subconsciously and unintentionally manipulate your team. If you've got a fear of failure, you're going to manipulate your team by micromanaging. If you have a fear of failure, you're going to manipulate your team by people pleasing, by being a friend and blurring those professional boundaries. These are not ways to productively influence your team to produce the results that you want. So when you increase both your internal and your external self-awareness, that means that you overcome and you manage your fears, which means that you're in a better position to provide more influence on your team. And that is going to have such a compounding snowball effect in your leadership. Everyone around you is going to think, geez, this person is a completely different leader, where all you've done is tweaked one or two small things. And the compounding effect is not only are you improving yourself, but you're improving your employees, and therefore you're improving the results that you produce, and therefore your clients are happy. And with all of this being said, there are many ways that you can increase your influence. And I've put all this in a circle of influence, and I've brainstormed a few things that you can try. The first one is to live by your values. So the values of the business, again, people first, demonstrate them. Also, talk about the values of the business. I'd also encourage, a great thing that you could do is to be so annoying about talking about your values to the point where your team becomes frustrated. Because if you keep bringing it to the top of your mind and you keep articulating, we're people first, we show patience, we show curiosity, we show understanding, naturally, because you're saying it 10, 20, 30 times, your team will start to think, damn, our values aren't just those 10 words on our website, they actually are important to our leader, therefore it's important to me. Some other things that I want you to do is really set some healthy boundaries. If your day ends at 5 o'clock, then your day ends at 5 o'clock. A simple way that you can really support your employees is you leaving at 5 o'clock on the dot. It's fine that if you do work later at night, but you're signaling to your team that, hey, it's actually safe to have healthy workplace boundaries. I really respect that about our boss because they went first in going home, therefore indirectly giving me permission to do the same and looking after myself. You can still work all you want when you get home, but what you're doing is you're signaling to your team that a clock off time is normal and a clock off time is a very fair boundary to have. The next thing you can do is really focus on your physical health and your mental health. So for me, I had to really turn that around because I want you to think about it. If you're an employee and your leader isn't someone who prioritizes their physical health and mental health, pretty simple. Are you inspired by them? Are you inspired to become like them or to learn from them or to be influenced by them? Chances are not really. And I realized that because I wasn't looking after myself, I wasn't inviting my team to bring out the best in themselves. So I really had to turn that around. Some other things that you can do is, let's look at the bottom part here, changing your behavior over time with a few micro habits. Here is a great concept that we're going to do in a future video. It's that you are about 5 small tweaks to your habits away from completely transforming the perspective of how your team sees you as a leader. And so here's 5, for example. If you're a leader who sits at a 90-degree angle when you're giving constructive feedback to someone, if you're a leader who provides 1 or 2 opportunities every day to either praise or acknowledge an employee, if you're a leader who is prioritizing their physical and mental health, if you're a leader who, whenever an employee knocks on your door and asks you a question, you put your phone in your pocket or you tilt your screen away so that you're not distracted and you show active listening, and if you're a leader who in a meeting says, I'm not sure about what you mean, or I'm not sure how to best approach this, or where are my blind spots that I can't see, those 5 really simple habits that you could introduce will fundamentally transform how your team sees you. And so overall, I promise you that by following these 4 steps, you're not only going to be able to live your best life and produce the career that you want to see and really provide an immense amount of value in your leadership journey, but you're going to see the others around you rise too. It means that your culture will go up, retention will go up because your team will want to work for you longer, and your productivity will go up. Leadership, I want to reaffirm with all of this being said, it's not easy. It's really hard. It's really hard to be vulnerable. It's really hard to overcome fears that might hold you back. But what I wanted to do in this video is to make the process of navigating those fears and those very real emotions simply. I want to reaffirm to you that if I can do it, I really wholeheartedly believe that you can do it too, and we're here to support you. And so if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe and also check out our Instagram page too. Thanks so much.